we're doing sample number 16 from your notebook. We're doing the Hong Kong seam finish. So the Hong Kong seam finish takes a couple extra steps, but it's a really nice seam finish, especially if you're not putting a lining in your garment or a coat. So you need your fabric samples, and then it uses bias tape, so packaged bias tape. In your kit that I gave you, you're going to find some bias tape. So first we're going to take your two pieces that are 5 by 9, and we're going to sew them with a 5/8 seam allowance. It's much easier if you use the 5/8 seam allowance than anything smaller than that, just because we're going to use such a big bias tape on this one. So I'm going to start by sewing with my seam allowance. And then the purpose of finishing the seam is that we want to cover that raw edge. And so I'm going to, before I press this seam open, I'm going to take my bias tape. And this one is a pretty wide bias tape. And I'm going to cover that. I'm going to have it wrap that seam allowance. And so it's going to cover that seam allowance. There we go. And I can pin that in place. So what I can do is I'm going to sew that on, and I can either straight stitch that, or I can use my zigzag stitch, because I want to stitch that on in one pass. I don't want to sew it and then have to sew it again in case I miss it. So a zigzag sometimes will catch both sides a little bit easier than a straight stitch. So I'm going to do one side with a straight stitch, and then the other side I'm going to demo with a zigzag. And on bias tape, you'll notice that one side is cut a little deeper than the other. So if you can sew on the side that's deeper than the other, then it will work out a little bit better. So I'm gonna stitch this on. This bias tape that I'm using is the wider kind. It comes in a narrower version. You want to use the narrower version for fabric that's not very bulky. This one's for a bulkier fabric, maybe if you're sewing wool or something that it needs to wrap over. You know, if your fabric is bulky, you're going to use a wide fabric to wrap around that bulk. So I did that with a straight stitch. Now I'm going to do this other side. I'm going to demo it using a zigzag. So I'm going to put that on there. And I'm going to pin it. And then I'm going to put a zigzag, and I'm just going to use the default zigzag on my machine, because it's just, I don't want to make it too wide, and I don't. I still want the fabric to be flexible. I want that seam to be flexible after I put this bias tape on there. So once I have that on there, I'm going to take my iron and I'm going to press my seam open just like a normal seam. It. So it's really, you can get really fun with your bias tape because it can be contrasting to your fabric, And so when you open if you're using it on a coat and you open your coat, it can be really cute on the inside of your garment. So that is a Hong Kong finish.